So let's talk about a time when the American dream basically turned into a national nightmare. We're diving into the Great Depression, a period of absolutely devastating economic collapse, and the radical, pretty controversial plan that tried to fix it all, the New Deal.
To really get what happened, we've got to rewind to the fall of 1929. The Roaring Twenties had been this wild party on Wall Street, right? Stock prices were soaring, fueled by speculation. It seemed like the party would never end. But, well, it was about to come to a screeching halt.
All right, first up, we're going to trace that chain of events that led to what was really the worst economic catastrophe of the 20th century. The collapse wasn't just one bad day. It started with a whisper. In the summer of 29, the really savvy investors started quietly selling off their stocks, sensing that this whole thing was a house of cards. But fear spreads like wildfire. The real panic hit on Black Thursday. And even though some big bankers tried to stop the bleeding, it all just came crashing down the next week on Black Tuesday. The bubble hadn't just burst, it had exploded.
And this is so important to understand. The stock market crash was just the spark. It set off this devastating domino effect. You had banks who had loaned out tons of money to investors just collapsing and taking people's life savings with them. Businesses couldn't get credit, so they had to shut their doors. The crisis on Wall Street had officially landed on Main Street. And believe me, it was about to get so much worse.
So now let's look at the real human cost of all this, because that's what really matters.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around the scale of the suffering. But this number gets us close. At its absolute worst, in 1933, a staggering 24.9% of Americans were out of a job. That's 1 in every 4 people. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 people you knew had no work. It's almost unimaginable today.
And what about your savings? Well, between 1929 and 1933, almost 10,000 banks failed. And get this, there was no federal deposit insurance back then. So when a bank went under, your family's savings just vanished. Poof! Billions of dollars gone overnight.
This number right here, it shows you just how badly the industrial heartland was hit. Nearly a quarter of all jobs outside of farming just disappeared. The factories and construction sites that were the roaring engine of the 1920s, they just fell silent.
Now, what's really interesting is that the pain of the Depression wasn't spread around equally. Men, who were mostly working in those hard-hit industries like manufacturing, they faced higher unemployment than women. And for young people, it was absolutely catastrophic. A third of them were out of work, their dreams just put on hold indefinitely. By 1933, the country was on its knees. I mean, farmers were losing their land, people were starving, and there was a very real fear of riots and revolution. It was into this climate of total desperation that Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in as president, and he promised something completely different. This was the question on everyone's mind. The country was desperate for an answer. The old ways of doing things had completely failed. The solution, whatever it was going to require a radical rethinking of the government's role in the economy and in people's lives. And then, with these famous words, FDR set out to do something amazing: restore the nation's confidence. He used the brand new medium of radio to speak directly to the American people in his fireside chats. He'd explain his policies in this calm, reassuring voice. It was a brilliant way to build trust and rally the country behind his agenda. So what was the New Deal exactly? Well, it wasn't one single neat plan. It was this massive, sprawling, and honestly often experimental series of programs and reforms. It was designed to attack the Depression from every single angle, stabilize the banks, create jobs, help farmers, and rein in the financial markets. The New Deal is famous for what everyone started calling its alphabet soup of agencies. The WPA, TVA, SEC, and on and on. To make any sense of it, it's really best to break them all down into 3 simple categories. Roosevelt's administration built its whole strategy around these 3 R's. It was pretty straightforward, really. First, provide immediate relief to people who were suffering right now. Second, get the engines of the economy, the farms and factories, humming again. And third, reform the whole system to make sure this could never, ever happen again. Now, relief wasn't just about handing out welfare checks. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, created millions of jobs building everything from roads and bridges to schools and parks. But it went even further than that.
with incredible programs that hired artists, writers, and musicians to document American life, which helped lift the whole nation's spirit. Recovery efforts were all about reviving key industries. You had things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, which tried to boost farm prices. And then you had massive projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought jobs, infrastructure, and electricity to one of the poorest parts of the country. But maybe the most lasting legacy of the New Deal was its reforms. The creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, finally brought some rules and oversight to the Wild West of the stock market. And the Social Security Act of 1935? Well, that established a national safety net for the elderly and unemployed, a fundamental change that still shapes American society today. The New Deal was hugely controversial, and it didn't end the Depression overnight, not by a long shot. But its legacy fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the American people and their government forever. And you can see here, the road to recovery was long and slow. While unemployment did fall from that crazy peak in 1933, it stayed stubbornly high all through the 1930s. It really wasn't until the massive industrial mobilization for World War II that the country finally got back to full employment. This right here, this might be the most lasting legacy of all. It's the social safety net. Before the 1930s, if you lost your job or got old, you had very little to fall back on. The New Deal changed that completely, creating programs like unemployment insurance and Social Security that are still a lifeline for millions of people to this very day. And the New Deal's legacy is also written in stone and steel. All across the country, you can still see the post offices, the schools, the dams, and the bridges that were built by its programs. This massive investment didn't just create jobs, it literally modernized the nation. So, what can we take away from all this? The New Deal was this incredibly bold, and sometimes controversial, response to a crisis without precedent. It completely changed the relationship between the government and its citizens. And it leaves us with a question that's just as relevant today as it was back then. In times of national crises, what is the right role for government to play?